Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out on a very crisp, sunny winter morning and to join us here to think about museums in our time. And as Maria has mentioned, her topic is global museums in shifting times. And actually for us, this is a very significant topic. We began the M+ Matters keynotes, and this is our third keynote. We do it annually. As a way of thinking about what it means for M+ to be making a new museum here in Hong Kong in the 21st century. And our first keynote was with the looking at Naoshima Island, and we had architect Sana and the founder of the Benesse Art Foundation, Fukutake-san, and his curator Akiko Miki come and speak about what that meant. Our second keynote was Louvre Abu Dhabi director Manuel Rabate, again talking about making a new museum in new worlds and museum complexes in the Middle East, in the United Arab Emirates. And today we have the very eminent Maria Balshaw, director of Tate, to address this topic from her point of view. I think for many of us, Maria is a great figure, a mentor, a leader, certainly as a woman museum director. And it's wonderful to see that there are more of us now into the 21st century, and that surely is to be applauded. But she has been in the role now since June 2017 and is responsible for all of Tate's strategic direction, as well as certain day-to-day operations. I'm sure not all. But she has really worked to reframe the context and perspective of what is a very long-established institution to engage with what it means to be working in this time today in the UK. The Tate, of course, was established in 1897 and is really, we all know it as one of the world's leading art institutions and is among the most visited institutions in the world as well as in the United Kingdom. It is comprised of 4 individual institutions: Tate Britain, the original one, Tate Modern, and both of them in London, Tate Liverpool, and Tate St. Ives. Just as an aside, as a very young art history graduate and wanting to begin working in museums, my first job was as a Tate intern in Tate Britain in the early 80s, 1981, I think it was, a long time ago, and there was only one Tate then. And I remember the work that I was doing was preparing what became Tate St. Ives. So it's really nice to be here, both at M+ in Hong Kong, but also to invite Tate director to talk about what it means to make museums, and especially out of what is a transforming and transformative institution. We will hear from Maria about how she's thinking about museum and her museums in the UK. And I know that her relationship with Hong Kong is something that I also want to touch on, because she, as a she's on the board of the CLO Leadership Program, and for 10 years came, I think, twice a year to Hong Kong from 2006 to 2016 to run those leadership courses here in Hong Kong, with the aim of providing the capacity in Hong Kong for future institutional leaders. And that too is something very important to set into the cultural fabric of this city. And so her relationship with Hong Kong is long-standing. Before I invite her to the stage, I need to acknowledge our relationship with Tobias and Tim and Tycoon. We are very happy to partner with this time's keynote, so thank you to you, Tobias. And finally, the Rosewood Hotel in Hong Kong. M+ is extremely happy for this SIG Prize, because of course Maria is here as part of the jury for our inaugural SIG Prize. The Rosewood has been an extraordinary partner for us, and so we thank them too. I think they've been very comfortable. So without further ado, Maria, please come and share.
Thank you very much, Sahanya, and thank you, all of you, for coming this morning. It's a real honour to be speaking to you about how we think about museums as well as how I think about Tate in the times that we're living in. I'll talk mostly about Tate. There are lots of things I'd be interested to discuss about how museums sit in this ecology, and so I'm not going to say too much about that in my paper because I thought we could pick that up in conversation and with questions with you. So please do think of things you'd like to ask me after I finish speaking. So, Tate, as Sahanya said, it began its life as a fledgling museum of British art, opened in 1897 on the site of London's most infamous prison in Millbank. So the building is different, but we were situated on the edge of the Thames because prisoners were sent from there all over the world. So if you like, and the ground that's underneath our institution, there is a reminder of Britain's colonial and imperial histories and its global links, and we can never get away from that. It was created as part of an act of Victorian cultural philanthropy to secure a British history of art. Tate was the first gallery that really committed to showing British art, and that was part of the development of an ambitious capital city at the heart then of an empire. It wasn't the only cultural institution created at that time. The V&A, the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, indeed the National Gallery, which was placed at the centre of Trafalgar Square, helping to create that centre of London, were all part of the same kind of programme of cultural works. And I wanted to point to that cultural infrastructure project because it seems to me it's not unlike that which Hong Kong has been pursuing this past decade in West Kowloon and elsewhere. It's what cities and countries do when they regenerate economically. They also start to expand their cultural infrastructure. So Tate's early history was to pursue British and then modern international collection building. And it did that for nearly 100 years before beginning to expand its remit. The building is the same as it was in 1897, although I have to say in those days it wasn't pink for gay pride. That's a kind of modern addition, if you like. The first foray outside London was to go to Liverpool as part of another explicit agenda about regeneration, fostered by Lord Heseltine, part of the Margaret Thatcher government, and it was supposed to jumpstart Liverpool out of post-industrial decline. It was placed in the old docks, again, a hub for imperial and colonial trade, and it was imagined as a place of engagement with the riches of the national collection as a way to bring Liverpool out of post-industrial decline after significant riots in the city. Now, Sahanya's first Tate was the original one. This was my first Tate. I arrived as a student in Liverpool just as Tate opened, and my parents took me for that goodbye meal that you do when you're dropping your son or daughter at university. We went down to the newly restored docks. I walked into Tate Liverpool and encountered Dali's lobster telephone. I was hooked, you could say. And it was probably where the journey to where I am now began. The collections on display at Tate Liverpool in those days were European and North American, white and largely male artists, and the same held for the curriculum that I encountered at the University of Liverpool. I was doing English literature, some history of art, and it drove me to move beyond that framework toward feminist critical theory that was emerging at the time as part of British cultural studies, and that was beginning to make an impact on some parts of the visual arts world and some parts of the academic curriculum. But really, it was only once I got out into the city of Liverpool, at things like the Video Positive Festival, where you saw the intersection of community and artistic practice, new media work. The Video Positive Festival became the Liverpool Biennial that still runs in that city. It was only through those things that I started to get a sense that my own lived experience and interests might be the stuff of art. And I point to that because actually what we have been living through in the last 20 or 30 years is a really fundamental shift from a singular history of art, if you like, to a multivocal and global sense of a diverse art history. But to go back to Tate's history, by the late 1990s, Tate was in expansion mode. Having outgrown its Millbank home, they'd started to collect international art, it started not to fit in the original building. And the collection began to reflect the world, and not just Europe and North America. But it was the conversion of a power station on the edge of the Thames, in a then rather desolate part of Southwark. It's hard to remember that now, it's so busy and full of commerce and retail now, that the great international gallery was created, and with that, a huge cultural shift. Louise Bourgeois' spiders arrived on the edge of the Thames and in the centre of the Turbine Hall, and it was built for 1.25 million people. There was great scepticism about the creation of Tate Modern. Perhaps you have encountered similar things here. The question was, who would ever want to come and see contemporary art? In its first year, more than 5 million people did come to see this strange practice of contemporary art. And what we saw in that moment was the niche sport, if you like, of contemporary art, a bit like fencing at the Olympics. On the television, very late at night, you need an explanation in terms of how to understand it. Fencing was becoming athletics. And contemporary art and discussion about it became part of the beating heart of London and, I think, then the world. So, more latterly, Tate Modern expanded again. This is the second part. Tate Modern 2, it was called for a while. It's now called the Blavatnik Building, after one of the major donors to the building. And in its first year, we saw 6.5 million people come to this building. Tate as a whole now has more than 8 million visitors annually. It is very definitely a mainstream sport now. So Tate's expansion changed London, making it a global centre for contemporary art. Frieze Art Fair was tiny when Tate Modern. The art scene was tiny in London. Again, it's hard now to remember that. But in expanding in this way, it also made contemporary art part of global discourse. There was also a shift in the content, if you like, and our thinking about art. So Tate's expansions in changing the art world also started to change art and art history. It has become less elite, more conscious, I think, of its role in shaping the public sphere and public opinion. Tate actively chose to change the art that was on the walls. It became, quite rapidly, less white and less Western. There was a regendering of the canon. We started to embrace the diverse centres of art that have emerged across the globe through the 20th and 21st century. But it's important to remember how recent this is and how far and fast we've travelled. When my colleague Frances Morris, who is now the director of Tate Modern, came to Tate in 1989, she remembers the then director of collection writing, in fact, that he considered the modern collection nearly complete. His work was almost done. When she worked on the first hang at Tate Modern in 2000, Tate broke the mould of the chronological star work, art movement-focused hangs, started to break the conventions of the canon. But even then, there were still only 3 women artists included, and no art to speak of from Africa, South Asia, Asia Pacific, or Australia. In the last 19 years, that has changed fundamentally, and we see this as one of the most important and active parts of our role. So we have forged acquisition committees across the globe to accelerate the collecting of work from regions beyond Europe and North America. We do that in partnership with the countries and continents, trying not to replicate, if you like, the original colonial imperial relations that the UK held to. And this is all part, I think, of us understanding the role of a museum and the building of a collection in a post-colonial, post-imperial world, so that we think about the ways in which art and artists are informed by and also shape contemporary debates about identity, power dynamics, and the politics of culture. So, what I'm beginning to say here is that this transformation wasn't only about built infrastructure, although I have shown you a number of buildings. It was about changing how people came to and can engage in art. And the tipping point for this is the work of a particular artist, I think, that was presented within this building. So, Olafur Eliasson currently has a wonderful exhibition on at Tate Modern, but the first time I encountered his work, the first time my daughter Lily encountered this work, age 3, was this piece, The Weather Project, the sun that seemed to hang in the mist of a turbine hall. This work was an invitation to make an art action in response to the sun. It changed forever. I mean, there were lots and lots of other works I could have chosen, but this is a kind of paradigm for a shift in how the public engage with an artwork. Lily, age 3, with her brother, age 5, lay on the floor and made the shapes of their names with their bodies, reflected in the mirrored ceiling. It was if you like, an unprecedented action by the public in response to this work. And it posed the idea that an artwork could be an invitation for the public to act as well as to look. And we see this legacy even now. So this is the Turbine Hall, most Fridays, most especially when there is a late happening in the space. Many kinds of people entering a space with the intention of contributing their own creative labour to the space. But I've talked a lot about London, and I'm conscious all the time of my 4 Tates, and as I travel around the world, the very different cultural ecologies and contexts that we work in. So this story about the way a public is changing in response to a museum also happened for Tate in Liverpool and in St Ives, away from the pressures and opportunities of a capital city. So the past 18 months have seen a beautiful refresh and expansion of Tate St Ives. The outside of the building, looking down to sea, looks like this at the moment, done by architect Jamie Faubert. The gallery won Museum of the Year in the UK in 2017, something that was delighted me and my colleagues. But it wasn't because of the building. Rather, it was because, although, I'll show you, this is Otterbong and Kanga, the exhibition that's on at the moment in Tate St Ives, and as you can see, the spaces are beautiful. But it was this expansion of space combined with a long-running, ground-up building of community and culture, in the sense that Stuart Hall has written about that wider sense of cultural activity. So Tate came to St Ives originally because of the artists, Barbara Hepworth particularly, but the modernist artists who made Tate St Ives their home. It was an artist's village and colony. And those artists helped shape the language and form of international modernism. But what we needed to do in making a museum in that space was connect to the creative dialogue and landscape of that place, as well as the tourist industry that helps sustain this beautiful part of the UK. And we've chosen to do this through listening to people and to local communities, and to give them a space to help them shape their own ideas and events. We've had a residency programme for artists, a community programme that has stretched not just across St Ives but across Cornwall, and the Museum of the Year prize money is being used to resource an artist-led community strategy that is about releasing the creative energies, if you like, of Cornwall. And I have quite a strange photograph to show you. So this is a project by artist Allard van Hume. It happened on the winter solstice last year. They're about to do another winter event next week. And it involved rolling a very large silver ball around the rather steep streets of St Ives. The ball started its journey around the town in a community that is only a mile from the gallery, but where the residents had never really engaged with what the gallery shows and offers, because they felt it wasn't for them. So the artists started by working with them to find out the cultural traditions and laws of Cornwall. Now, there's a very special game that happens in the winter in St Ives and some other Cornish towns that involves throwing a small silver ball onto the sands of the beach and unleashing the children of the town to find the silver ball. And whoever wins the silver ball is crowned king or queen for the day. So they took that tradition and made it into a ball big enough for everyone to find and engage, and in fact push around the town. And it made its creative journey all the way through the streets, eventually bringing itself and the crowds to the front door of Tate St Ives. And in that process, a new cultural tradition has been made through the engagement of a community and the artist. And you know, completely balmy and wonderful. Through this, I think we start to root ourselves in a community, but also we bring the insight and reflection that only an artist can bring to a place. So I hope at the moment Tate's 4 museums are thriving spaces for art and also for people. And if you like, my years at Tate are characterised by the movement from buildings to people and the art that we find within it. By embracing the idea that art and artists and audiences have a radical role to play in shaping the institutions that we want to see for the future. So sometimes I come into work and I encounter things like this. So, today we are mainly changing the world. This was a sign that was taking people up to Tate Exchange at Tate Modern, something I'll come back to in a moment. But where we are in terms of our thinking is that we are beginning to explore, sometimes successfully, sometimes less well. We are beginning to explore what an open, collaborative institution could look like within the cities and towns that we're based. So, what much of this is about is not so much the bricks and mortar that you build. You need those. If you like, the infrastructure I was given by Nick Sirota was an extraordinary estate. And the role of my colleagues and me as director at the moment is to make sure that we live up to the potential of the bricks and mortar and concrete, and actually take it beyond the walls of the gallery. So much of what we're doing at the moment is exploring the expansion of narratives. And this takes me back to my earlier point about how Tate has stepped very significantly beyond the well-trodden roots of 20th century and even 21st century art history. So I thought it was important that I show you what is on and going on across Tate right now, so that I hope you'll see in my few slides some things that if you're coming to London next year, you might want to seek out and encounter. Because it's not all about big exhibitions. We have at the moment a free display on in Tate Modern called 1973. It's the first of a series of experiments about what happens if you take a year or a particular place and or even a particular idea and explore it in depth through the collection. So 1973 was a hugely significant date for Latin America and for Chile in particular. It's the year that Allende's government was overthrown by the dictator Pinochet, bringing in a military dictatorship which saw major resistance by artists of that region, including the artist Cecilia Vicuña. And she made a series of works called The Precarios, which we can see some of here. She said, in the beginning, in making these works, I wanted to prevent the coup. Now the objects intend to support armed struggle against the reactionary government. The objects, and this I think is a wonderful phrase, the objects try to kill 3 birds with 1 stone, politically, magically, and aesthetically. So this is what she's exploring through these extraordinary pieces. Alongside Cecilia's work, we see Artists for Democracy and a collection of arpulleras, small textile works, which even 5 years ago would not have been considered eligible for Tate's collection. They would have been read, I think, as ethnographic and placed in either the V&A or perhaps the British Museum. And so the social activism and the aesthetic and political critique that they represent wouldn't have been encompassed within the art historical narratives that Tate was able to explore. So what we're doing in bringing work like this into the collection and presenting it in a way that I think is very digestible for the public is to move speedily beyond the ways in which we have long thought about what counts as art. So this means for us accepting that for many decades, if not centuries, fine artists have been using cloth and clay and found materials. Indigenous practice needs to be recognised as practice alongside those artists who are trained within our art establishments. Because if we don't step beyond the things in which we are trained and taught to be part of the museum, we will not be part of the evolving histories of art that our institutions need to embrace. Now, I think these works are beautiful and extraordinary. The public are responding to them wonderfully, but I have to be honest about the pain that the institution has had to go through to get to an acceptance that these two are the stuff of art. Often the biennials and the kinds of exhibitions that are made have been combining this sort of work and trailblazing for us, but those institutions that have long histories and rooted collections, we can be slow to move. And so I see this as very radical and fundamentally ground-shifting work. You can see how important this is if you look at the recently expanded MoMA. Now, some of us at Tate might walk around the new galleries at MoMA, which look beautiful, and there's marvellous work there, and say, this is looking quite familiar. This is looking like the display strategies that have been deployed at Tate, across the 4 Tates, for at least the last decade. So this is the image that was shown almost everywhere in the newspapers. Picasso combined with Faith Ringgold. That particular Faith Ringgold was in a Tate show called Soul of a Nation just 2 years ago, and MoMA bought it from that show. So for the longest time, MoMA mostly didn't make this kind of shift, and they have had to do a super rapid acceleration to bring forth to the public a more diverse combination of art. Now, I'm not entirely convinced that this combination works. I'm not sure Glenn would appreciate me saying that very much, because I would prefer, actually, to see one of Faith's textile works. They're more characteristic of her practice. It's bolder work, and this piece refers to a different Picasso. It refers to Guernica, not Demoiselle d'Avignon. Nevertheless, I felt my heart sing as I walked around MoMA and saw significant displays of textile art, Annie Albers and the cohort of artists around hers, starting to see every part of the world brought into dialogue with the greats, the star pieces of MoMA's collection. And so even our kind of grandest institutions globally are starting to make these shifts and respond to, if you like, the urgency of thinking through political as well as formal and aesthetic innovation side by side. There are other great examples in MoMA. You see former outlier Lynn Hirschman, whose work in performance and video art and artificial intelligence and virtual reality has for a long time sat outside the 20th century American canon. She's now brought inside, placed alongside Eduardo Katz, the great Latin American computer art innovator. And Lynn said a great thing. She said, finally, the place that should always have been our home has remembered we were here. These histories have always been part of the 20th and 21st century, but for a long time, institutionally, we were quite good at keeping them separate. But these much welcomed shifts don't mean that we're finished. Far from it, I think. So whilst I am very pleased that Tate has often led the way in this area, I think we're only at the beginning of a next chapter, which is the post-capital phase, but also the post-colonial phase for institutions that have long imperial and colonial histories. And we have to move in this direction because these are the questions our public are bringing into the spaces now. So the questions we have to ask ourselves are, how do we connect to a more diverse and expanded audience? How do we meet their future needs? I think we actually have to ask ourselves, how do we meet the future needs of artists? Because as we saw with the Turner Prize earlier this week, artists' ideas often run far ahead of institutional rules and frameworks, and that's a good thing. We have to hold an open mind in relation to these matters, because then we are exploring in a very live way the value of art to society. So I suppose now the next bit of my talk is the kind of the politics we're living in at the moment. Hong Kong, as in the UK, going through, I think, unprecedentedly difficult times. In the UK, we're struggling with divisions over Brexit and the underlying economic disparities that cause such divided views about our society. And across the globe, never mind here in Hong Kong, the challenges posed by the movement of peoples, conflicts, the rise of nativism and nationalisms, uneven wealth distribution, and, as Greta Thunberg demands that we remember, the threat of global climate change. So your difficult situation here is only one amongst many, many examples we could point to across the globe. And in the museum sector, we are in our own tough times, if you like, as the latest version of the culture wars, aided by ever more rapid social media and a really disputatious public sphere, can sometimes make me feel like I want to hide in my office, not kind of step into the world, because there is daily argument about what we are doing and what is going on in our world. However, I am an optimistic person, and I hold to the sense that openness and connectedness is the only constructive response in our now. Because actually, I see very much that is positive, even as we're wrestling with these difficult polarizations, because we've started to see the emergence with the public, with artists, within institutions, of a very popular political form of cultural and artistic activity. I noticed on the front page of the FT Arts section this morning that there is a long piece about the activist art that has been part of the protest movements here in Hong Kong. And so we are finding creative responses to the times that we're in. So when I arrived at Tate, the first Turbine Hall was the Danish collective Superflex, who made swings and a long carpet in the turbine hall. It was called 1, 2, 3 swing, and that is what many, many people did. They imagined people as the kind of energy creators, driving the new turbine hall that is dedicated to culture. And the carpeted slope was supposed to, in the words of the artist, cultivate apathy. So, find contemporary life stressful, come and lie down here. That seems to me not a bad message from an artwork. But this piece was seized upon by the press as an example of the art museum as playground, as if we should be sniffy about that. And I'd want to defend its political urgency and agency. So a work like this depends on many kinds of people being made welcome in a space. You have to feel comfortable before you start messing about on the swings or laying down. And it's no easy thing to make very different kinds of people feel comfortable in a space of art. We find it slightly more straightforward in Tate Modern than in Tate Britain because there are many entrances. Herzog and de Moran imagined this turbine hall as a covered street. So it has within its architecture a certain sense of openness. But many visitors would tell you it's a big, concrete, forbidding space to enter. So not so much when it has a weird stripy carpet in it. But the challenges of a building like Tate Britain, you walk up those stairs because you are ascending into the temple of art. And there is much that has to be overcome for visitors who haven't had that as part of their life experience. So the artworks that start to undo, if you like, the implicit exclusions of buildings and spaces seem to me very interesting. This year's Turbine Hall Commission by Cara Walker takes this still further, and I think is a genuine act of political insurgency, if you like, within our building. This piece, for those of you, many of you probably haven't seen it, but I hope you will have seen it on Instagram or other forms of social media or in the newspapers. It's been extraordinarily positively received by audiences. It's called Fons Americanus. It is a very large piece of public sculpture inside our building. It's filled with water. You're allowed to sit around the edge of it. It is modelled on the Victoria Memorial, which sits in front of Buckingham Palace. Now, I would say as a Londoner, I never see that piece of public sculpture, even though I go round it almost every day. You come up from Tate Britain to get into town. It's an annoyance that I move around, because that's what we do in our cities and with our architecture. We tune out the visual information that we don't need. But Cara came on a site visit to Tate Modern to work through what she was going to present in this huge space, a space which often intimidates the hell out of artists. And she was in a taxi going back to Heathrow, and she went down the Mall and she went round the sculpture. And of course, as an unfamiliar visitor to London, she saw it. And as you would expect from public sculpture of that period, it tells the story of Queen Victoria's might. It tells the story of her conquering of empire, the gratefulness of all the countries of the world for this benign and beneficent queen. So it's a piece of it's oppression in stone form, and as soon as she laid eyes on it, she realised what she needed to make, which is roughly the same, but is the public art that we need for now. So the elements of her memorial speak clearly to what she calls the invisible continent, the watery continent that joins the UK to Africa, to America and Latin America. And it's filled with elements that tell the story of slavery, the brutality of those movements. But to me, the genius of this work is the playbill that goes with it. which is pasted up on the wall. And it gives us, if you like, the introduction to the work. It tells us how we, as a public, can view it. It mimics, as so much of Kara's work does, the language of the slave era. So imagine that this introduces a travelling circus or a spectacle that comes to town. And what I find so extraordinary about this piece is her come, one and all, to marvel and contemplate the monumental misrememberings of colonial exploitation, gasp plaintively, sigh mournfully, gaze knowingly, and regard the immaterial void of the abyss, etc., in a delightful family-friendly setting, curated by that celebrated negress of the New World, Madam Kara E. Walker, NTY. In that writing, she presents, critiques, and then offers us a position in relation to an incredibly uncomfortable history. And she uses words that many people think are not acceptable in the present time, but of course they are part of the history that we carry with us. She mocks, frankly, the conventions of the modern museum, where, however difficult the art is, everything does need to be family-friendly. But she simultaneously says, sit down on the edge of the sculpture. She's encouraged people to throw coins in, just as we would if we were sitting in a park. And to me, she is offering us both pleasure and discomfort as a way of acknowledging the past, the present, and a different future for us as an institution, for the place of art in society, and she gives us a constructive take on a difficult critique. It seems to me a triumph of a piece. However, so this is all going on in the Turbine Hall, but there are many other notable experiments at the moment at Tate that I want to briefly share with you. So it's about, for us at the moment, listening differently to the constituencies who help to shape our institution. That means listening to our public, to artists, but also to our staff. So over the past few years, an internal activism has been driving the thinking of Tate. Staff networks, Black and Minority Ethnic Network, LGBTQ+ network, networks for parents and carers, and for disabled staff, have been staging a critical dialogue about what we show, why we show it, and who is it for. And out of that comes an exhibition programme that now starts to look more reflective of the world that Tate operates in, not just the art world. So next year, you will see Zanele Muholi. Their work, many of you may have seen it in Venice. Their work is both aesthetically extraordinary, politically charged and challenging. But for our staff network, it is the beginning of seeing their lived experiences and identities showcased as part of the mainstream exhibition programme at Tate. And knowing that that won't be a niche show, that actually is about part of the mainstream dialogue that we want to have about what does art look like, who makes it, and who is it for in 2020. For me, this is really interesting because it also affects the way that we think of the great figures of, if you like, the established canon. So alongside Zanele's work, we are also making a Warhol show. This is one of 57 works that come from Andy Warhol's engagement with the trans community in New York in the early 1980s. And he made friends with and then photographed and made works from a body of people whose names and identities we now know. And that feels an incredibly important part of this exhibition. So these remarkable trans portraits will have both names for each work, and Tate's interest and the Warhol Foundation's research came together to say, if we are making a Warhol show for our times, we want to look at the histories of challenging conventions around gender identity. And we absolutely know this will be a queer Warhol show for our times. It doesn't critique the recent Warhol show that the Whitney did, which was the kind of the monumental retrospective. But actually, for Tate, we need this show. For London at the moment, we need this show. And what excites me about this kind of work is that this programmatic shift in attitude is really appealing to a more diverse audience. So we are simultaneously seeing younger people engage much more actively and a growth in our older demographic. So this isn't about turning only towards kind of youth and contemporary culture. It's actually activating audiences across a very, very wide spectrum. But a focus on youth has been really important for us. And again, I think this is part of ensuring that Tate will be relevant in 50 years' time. Or 20 years' time, because we will have spent time thinking through what the 19 and 20-year-olds now want and need. So we did some research, and we found out that one thing that the younger audiences, especially art students, can't do is afford to pay for our exhibitions. So ticket prices in the current kind of commercial organisation of major institutions like mine sit at around £20 to £25. So if you are doing art at the Courtauld or at the Royal College, and I know there's somebody here that is, £25 is a big ask on a student budget. So we launched a membership scheme for under 25-year-olds based on what that younger demographic said they would value. And so it's free to sign up. I would recommend anyone under 25 to sign up because you get loads of online benefits. Doesn't matter that you're not in London. And then that free membership entitles you to exhibition tickets that are £5 only for you and 3 friends. So the exhibition visiting process becomes a social occasion with art at the heart of it. We have currently 135,000 members. It's only been running for 12 months. My ambitious team said if we got to 50,000 after a year, that would be remarkable. But this has grown faster than we can keep up with it. And to share some statistics about who that means is coming, for under 25s, 24% of our visitors are black and minority ethnic. That shouldn't surprise us because London under 25 is actually 45% black and minority ethnic, so we're still not even meeting the demographic of the city. But it's roughly double that which any other museum or gallery in the UK gets. And I feel we've still got much more to do there because as one of my younger staff members said to me, he said, Maria, don't compare us to other traditional old, he might have said boring, museums. Compare us with the world, because that's where Tate wants and needs to be. And he's quite right to set that challenge to me. So we've got to do more. And then when we start to think about the complex interrelationships between class, gender, educational background, have you been taken to any kind of cultural activity, have you not, where do you live, how expensive is transport, when we think about all of those things, we've got huge work to do to make it that engagement with a weird and amazing diversity of art is part of the normal life of everyone and not just a small number of people. So for me, this is about social justice and ensuring that everybody experiences the benefits of culture and cultural activity, but actually it's also about my business model and my commercial future. Because if I am not investing now in the people who will be the members in the future and who will be paying full price for the exhibition tickets and wanting a lovely meal in the level 9 restaurant, when they've got a nice job, I won't have an audience in the future if I don't think through how we remain relevant for younger audiences now. So I've got another project to share with you that is at Tate Britain that is absolutely about this combined investment, if you like, in changing the world writing the cultural justice scales, if you like, and thinking about our future audience. So this is a very standard English school photograph. Do they happen in the same way in Hong Kong? Yes, very good, yeah. Everyone has to sit in the line, teacher at the centre. But you'll notice that the teacher in this image has quite an old-fashioned hairstyle. So this is a photograph from 1977, and it's the school photograph of British artist Steve McQueen. Steve grew up in London. He went to a school in Little Ealing. That school is just near Grenfell Towers, where the tragic fire happened a little over 2 years ago. He has been thinking about a project based on this school photograph for 20 years, but the terrible incident at Grenfell, if you like, accelerated the urgency of his thinking. So with Art Angel, the non-building-based arts organisation, Steve came to Tate and said, I want to make a project that would make a school photograph of every year 3 child, 7 and 8 year olds, in London. And I want to then make that into an art work that would fill the Devines galleries. It's an extraordinary idea. And as soon as I heard this, I said, we have to do this. And then kind of went back to meet colleagues who work in Tate Learning and Tate Curatorial, and we all said, how are we ever going to do that? There are thousands of schools, tens of thousands of children across London. How will we manage it? So for the last 2 years, we have been working out that how. And for the last 3 weeks, commuters around London have been encountering this year's Year 3 school children across the tube networks, across the posters, across London. We have photographed 76,146 children. That's across nearly 1,600 schools in every borough in London. We discovered in doing this project that some boroughs, schools didn't visit Tate at all. If you live in outer London, the journey into central London is a very, very long way. So the cultural riches of London are not distributed equally, not even close. So the project became a process of saying we have to ensure that there is equal engagement, that every school and every child matters in this project. They've all been photographed. They are now all on display in the Devine galleries. The opening was the most exciting and extraordinary event I have attended in a very, very long time. They are hung. Everyone is hung in this. They're photographed in the same way. They are hung in the same way. Steve trained 9 photographers. Those photographers went out across London, and they typically went to 4 schools in a day, did 4 sets of photographs every day of the week through a 6-month period. Every school had a workshop about what it means to make art, be an artist, think like an artist. Steve went into many of those schools. The opening night, he told the most extraordinary story that he hadn't shared previously. He said, the thing is, I was brought here when I was 7. He said, I came on a minibus. He said, it was the first time I'd been on a bus like that. It was the first time I'd been to central London. He said, I used to draw at home. He said, I walked up the stairs and came into Tate Britain, and I saw works on the wall that told me that this thing that I did meant something. And he then said, it gave me my liberty. Now, he said that in front of the very cynical English press. There was not a dry eye in the house. But that's the fundamental to this project, that it is an enactment of a form of cultural liberty. Every child that's photographed, each school has been invited back. So at the moment at Tate Britain, there's chaos. We have 600 children coming every day, 20,000-ish coming every weekend. We've had to build a porter cabin village in the car park at the back of the museum so that there are enough toilets, enough places to leave their bags, enough places to do the workshop. Each child is given a booklet, which is their engagement with this work. They have to go and find themselves. And there's a huge emphasis on this is yours. Each photograph will go back to the school. Each child will get their own version of the photograph. So it's been about creating a cultural passport, if you like, to a future engagement with not just Tate, but with any kind of museum. Because once you've crossed the threshold, once you've been taken up the stairs and found yourself in this project, literally found yourself, you know in a very fundamental way that these things are for you. And that, for me, is the act of cultural rebalancing. So it's been very exciting. It is about, as we say in Tate Exchange, which is the final example I want to share with you, about saying hello to people and really meaning it. So we aren't, of course, the only institution globally that is thinking about these issues of engagement, creation of a future audience, and so on. But there is one part of Tate's work which I think is really unique. It's called Tate Exchange. I know some people in the audience heard my colleague Anna Cutler talk at the Museum Summit last week about the work that we do here. So I'm not going to spend too long about it. But within the DNA of the building at Tate Modern, but also within Tate Liverpool and in different ways at Tate St Ives and Tate Britain, we have created a space where we explore actively where and how culture is made. So this was a project run by some Southwark-based students who wanted to ask everybody that came through Tate Exchange, where does culture happen for you? What counts as culture? As a way of starting to map and redefine it. But very often within Tate Exchange is a program which is always led by an artist, but always delivered by associates, other organisations and people who are not Tate, who might be across the UK. So there are 84 associates in total now in Liverpool and in London. There are Tate Exchange associates in the Welsh Valleys, right the way down in Cornwall, on a far Scottish island. And there are some that are micro-local, that are kind of practically on our doorstep, like the Thicker Black Lines, a black-led artist collective just outside Tate Modern. But what happens is that the associates and the artists create experiences for people to generate new ideas and meaning. So my super speedy example is the artist-led creation of a factory. Claire Toomey brought 8 tons of clay into the building and created a factory production line where the public were invited to produce objects that were then gifted on to the next visitor. So anyone could make them, from youngest children through to oldest visitors, and then exchange them. But that was only the beginning of the project. The next week, people were asked to describe the experience of working on the production line, to talk about their own labour and their own creative labour. The passing visitors clocked in and clocked out and debated, what do we want our cultural values to be now? Those were turned into a set of banners. They were hung through the space. People were given cards as they came in to take away a value for our time. They talked about tolerance, liberty, freedom of speech, creativity. And what it became was an exchange between cultural equals, because in the making together and debating together and shaping what the work can be in the space, the cultural imbalance I talked about starts to close. And it presumes that our public bring in for us valuable information about what we need to think about in terms of art. And for me, this exchange between equals needs to be the fundamental that we take forward across Tate. Claire, as an artist, said, I thought it was about art meeting society, but it became society meeting art. And I believe, she said, what's happening in Tate Exchange will influence what's on the future walls of this institution. She said, we're participating in the creation of artist citizens. Another person said, Tate Exchange is a place for conversation. People in London don't talk to each other. Tate Exchange should be the face of London. And I think when people say that about our institution, we are starting to walk in the right direction. Because most public institutions want to open and expand and engage. We don't sit outside society. But we often have so much institutional baggage ourselves, we don't think about the things that we need to let go in order to open up that conversation. And through the give and take of art that happens in Tate Exchange, we are starting to be revolutionary. An art museum that is reflecting and engaging with its citizens on a mission to create a more open world. So, these are my final words. It seems to me that the reasons that the Victorians invested in culture, that Hong Kong in the past decade has invested in cultural institutions, is very clear. If we look at the research, being actively engaged in any form of cultural activity makes you smarter, happier, more healthy, more likely to get a job, keep a job, more likely to live well in the world. Yeah, that's kind of revolutionary for the 21st century, especially when you think about the problems of our time. So post-Brexit Britain or Hong Kong at the moment is all about intolerance between people, inequalities, social isolation. It's worse if you are poor. It's much worse if you're poor and elderly. We know these problems, and art doesn't fix them, but it being a rooted part of our life and existence builds the human capacity to embrace change well, to live with resilience, and to dream of a better world. So we shouldn't be like Victorian missionaries trying to cure people by engaging with art, but we have to be the champions for the sense that cultural engagement contributes to the living of a good life. And it is even more necessary as the world moves faster, it becomes more complex, because art gives us the language and tools to respond with empathy and sensitivity and nuance. And as we do this, we also start to create a global art ecology that works to undo that hierarchy and history of exclusion I talked about at the beginning. And what I see in the best parts of Tate and in many other institutions across the globe is that with our public and with artists, we are starting to work towards a more engaged and multivocal and activated art for our now. And we are creating institutions that are open to the world, whatever challenges that world brings. Long may that continue.